Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining the call. If you're not aware, Councilman O'Rourke introduced a couple of bills last year. They came up to a hearing. There was actually three bills that he introduced last year. One of them was passed. The other two were held. We were hoping that they weren't going to come up again. Hoping against hope. We kind of knew that they would be, and now they are. The hearing is set for February the 10th at 10 o'clock in City Hall. It would be extremely helpful if you could testify at that hearing or at least show up at the hearing. The more people that show up, the better. The problem we have when we go to these hearings is that the tenant organizations bring out the tenants in droves. And we as landlords have a couple of people there, and it looks really bad from our standpoint because it looks like the tenants care a lot more than we care. That obviously is not the case, but that's the way it appears to them. So it's really important that we have the numbers present at the hearing, and if you'd be willing to testify and explain to City Council about the problems with the bill, that'd be awesome. I'm going to go through the details of the bill with you. I'm not going to go through it totally because they're very lengthy bills, but I'm going to go through the major issues that we do have with the bill so you understand the problems with them. The first biggest issue we have with the bill is it creates good cause, which means that before you can terminate a lease, you have to have good cause for being able to terminate that lease in Philadelphia. Currently, there is a bill out that was passed many years ago that provided for good cause to be able to terminate a lease for all leases that are under 1 year. It's really upsetting because we spent months negotiating that bill to come up with a compromise. The compromise being that it would only apply to leases for less than 1 year. While we weren't happy with that at all, we were pretty much forced to agree to it at the time. Now they want to go back on that compromise and say that it applies to all leases. The problem with that is you would need a really good reason to be able to terminate a lease at the end of the term. What often happens is that you have a tenant that's a problem tenant. They're causing all sorts of issues at the property. They're making it very difficult for the other tenants, but they're paying their rent. So you can't evict them for non-payment of rent. Now, I tried to explain to city council that landlords don't like to just evict people. They're not just evicting them because they're good tenants. There's obviously a problem here that you need to get that tenant out of the property. So for whatever reason, they're causing a problem, but it doesn't rise to the level where you're going to take it to court and a judge is going to rule in your favor. And that's another unfortunate problem we have in Philadelphia is that judges bend over backwards to allow the tenants to stay in the property. So unless you have a really egregious situation, a judge is not going to rule in your favor. So what we have now is that when the lease is up, you can at least terminate it at the end of the term. What this new bill is saying is that at the end of the term, you will not be able to terminate it unless you have really good cause to be able to do so, and that's a problem. So that's the first issue we have with the bill. And by the way, for those of you who want to look at the actual bill, you can go on the city's website. Their bill's numbers 250329 and 250330. Okay. The second major problem with the bills is that it provides for an abatement of rent if there is an L&I violation against the property such that you're unable to get a rental license or a certificate of rental suitability. The way the law is now, and there was a court decision on this, it specifically says that if you don't have your certificate of rental suitability and haven't given that to the tenant or your rental license, that you can't collect the rent. However, if the tenant has paid you the rent, the tenant isn't entitled to that rent back. So if you didn't have the certificate of rental suitability or you just didn't give it to the tenant, even though you don't have any violations against the property, if the tenant has paid you the rent, you can keep the rent. What this new bill says is that you would now have to give back to the tenant all the rent that they paid you. So if you just made a mistake, you didn't realize you needed to give a certificate of rental suitability, even though you didn't have any violations against your property, but just didn't give that certificate to the tenant does not have to pay your rent, and any rent they paid you, they'd be able to get back. That's a huge problem. And that's one that is just totally unacceptable to us. I get the situation that city council is trying to address where there's actually violations against the property and there's a problem at the property, but the law already provides for that. The law already has remedies for that. And if the tenant believed that there was such a problem at the property, we all know they just stop paying the rent, right? Tenant's got a problem, tenant's got no heat. What's the first thing they do? They stop paying the rent. And guess what? If they go to court, the judge is going to give them a rebate of the rent if they go ahead and fight it. Okay. But if there's not a problem that rises to such a level that the tenant's not paying the rent, there's absolutely no reason they should be getting that rent back. Okay. It's the same situation that we have with the lead paint certification. That's not part of this bill, but I can tell you that in the lead paint certification, if the tenant isn't given it, then they do get an abatement of rent. That already exists. They want to extend that abatement, meaning the tenant's getting all that rent back, to not having a rental license or a certificate of rental suitability. Okay. The next issue is that under these bills, they want you as the landlord, when you get a notice of violation, within 7 days, you have to notify the tenant that you have a violation against your property. Now, keep in mind, the law says you have 30 days to take an appeal. So if you intend to take an appeal, it's not going to help you because within 7 days you have to notify the tenant. And guess what's going to happen as soon as you notify them? They're going to stop paying the rent. Huge problem. If you have a property that has multiple units in the property, but only one license. So let's say you have a 10-unit building, but the one license covers the 10 units, your one residential license. Okay. If you have a violation against one of those units, then you're not going to be able to get the license for all the other 9 units either. So for all 10 units, you're not going to be able to get licensed. And now you're going to have to notify all 10 of those tenants that there's a situation where you can't get the rental license and they don't have to pay the rent. This is devastating. Next thing they want to do is have proactive inspections by licenses and inspection. So right now, the way L&I works is if there's a violation against the property, somebody reports the violation or they feel like there's something that rises to the level of violation, there's some problem at the property, L&I will come out, inspect it, and if they feel that it warrants it, they will issue a violation. What they want to do now is have every single unit inspected prior to you being able to rent out the unit. What that's going to do is, aside from the fact that it's going to create a major problem for L&I because they just don't have the manpower to do it, and they weren't afforded the money in the budget to be able to do that. But putting all that aside, if that does happen now, before you're going to be able to rent a property, you're going to have to get somebody from L&I to come out and do that inspection. So that's going to create a delay before you're going to be able to rent out the property. And as we all know, every delay in being able to rent out your property costs you money. It's lost rent. So that's a problem. And the final major issue is that they want to change the burden of proof in the case that arises under this ordinance to say that the burden of proof is now on the landlord. Normally in the court, When you go to court, the plaintiff, the person bringing the lawsuit, has the burden to prove their case. You defend the case, but the burden of proof is on the person bringing the action. What they want to say is even if the tenant brings the action against you as the property owner, you as the property owner now have the burden of proof to prove that you're in the right. A lot of times, not to get too technical with this, it becomes very difficult to do because sometimes you're trying to prove a negative. And now the burden of proof is on you to prove that. And that's another problem that this law has. So those are the five major things. The laws are rather lengthy. I think one of them's over 11 pages and the other one's even longer than that. Don't have time during this call to go through every single